when you read someone's story, when people put it out there, I find I relate to much more than anything that I don't relate to, and we have a lot of very similar experiences in our recovery, in our lives, actually. So.
Well, we're the same age too. That always helps. The thing that's I think sort of one of the key points. I actually was introduced to recovery 35 years ago today, August the 5th, 1989, in a crack house in Harlem, New York. And I think I went to my first 12-step meeting either that same day in the psych ward or maybe it was the next day. But anyway, at the time, I aspired, like everybody else aspires, to have sort of what I call the V-shaped recovery, where you go down and then you go up and you live happily ever after, sort of a linear recovery. And I discovered that ain't, the longer I've been at it, the more I discover it ain't no linear recovery.
All you can hope is that overall you trend upwards, right?
Yeah. And that's why recovery capital has been so critical to me over the decades. And I didn't contemplate any of that stuff until I had my encounter with pain meds a decade ago, because I just assumed that, you just keep going up. Although I started to question, like, what does it mean to be sober versus what does it mean to be in recovery? Anyway, so I started contemplating these things, kind of like navel gazing, for a long time. And then all the other experiences I've had manifested themselves in this telling of this story. So I'm glad that we have a chance to do it together here.
Yeah, so we were both born in 1959. I think back on my recovery. I, don't have the famous father like you do, but I had achieved a certain status, like I was a golf pro and at a local golf course, which I thought, my ego and pride was out of control. Thought it was the most wonderful thing. And then cocaine quickly dropped me to my knees. And at the birth of my first daughter, I was lucky enough to find recovery back in 1987, and have maintained it since. And I agree with the highs and lows of it. There's in the opening to your new book, Broken Open, I was struck by these words where the guy heard you speak and you gave him a big bear hug, he gave him a big hug, and you said, I believed in him. And I never heard from my parents when I was growing up. I know they loved me, they cared for me. I was not deprived by any mean or abuse, but I never heard that term, I believe in you. And now anytime someone comes to CCAR and is employed, we have an onboarding. I look them deep in the eyes, soul to soul, and this is what I say. I say, I believe in you, because it's true, and those words have so much power. And I want to say to you, in case you haven't heard it, wow, and I didn't expect to get choked up so early, but I do believe in you, William, and I have from the first time we met. And I will get into the story of how you've had a role in the formation of CCAR, whether you know it or not. What do those words mean to you? I believe in you.
I think, Bill, at its essence, it's about hope. I learned through the course of my own journey, which began 35 years ago today, August 5th of 1989. I found that hope is a strategy. They talk in business or even in the nonprofit world. You can't just have hope as your strategy. You got to have a strategic plan, whether you're CCAR, Hazel and Betty Ford, or IBM, or Delta Airlines. You got to have a strategy, and yet, because addiction is an illness that strips people and families of hope, you really have to hold on to hope. And for me to be able to say to you or to people I encounter in recovery meetings or when I'm giving speeches, I believe in you, is essentially to say, I have hope for you, and I have hope for me. Because oftentimes with substances, as I said, they strip us of that dignity, that respect, and they smother us with shame, part of that stigma that we know so well. So what else is there to ward that off at its very core but hope? So when I say I believe in you, what I'm saying is I have hope for you, and that doesn't mean that you're necessarily struggling or you aren't where you need to be in life. But what I'm saying is I have hope for you, because hope is what sustains us through those high highs and those low lows. So that's really what it means to me, Phil.
Yeah, that's remarkable. The story about CCAR is we were founded by Bob Savage in
Yes.
1998. He heard you speak somewhere
Huh.
about putting a face on recovery, probably in first when you first started in 98, something
Mhm.
like that, 97, 98,
96.
yeah,
Yeah.
96, 97. He heard you, and that was how CCAR was founded, this idea of just putting a face on recovery.
I did not know that. Of course, I have such a reverence for Bob,
Mhm.
like I do for you and all that remarkable team that you put together there. I mean, not only are you making a difference, but you've been making a difference for a long, long time.
Mhm.
A lot of RCOs or recovery community organizations, a lot of treatment centers, they sort of come and go, come
Mhm.
and go. But CCAR has sustained because you're making a difference. I In 1996, I started working for Hazelden, what was then called Hazelden, as a policy analyst. And very early on, I realized that if we were going to change public policy around addiction, we needed to change public perception. We needed to change media perception. We needed to change policy perception. And I discovered that the only way really to do that was to tell my story.
Mhm.
If I wasn't willing to stand up and speak out and say to my audience, whatever that was, hey, this is what an addict and an alcoholic, that was the language we used at the time. This is what the addict and the alcoholic look like. I'm one of them. Addiction doesn't discriminate, neither should recovery. When I stood up and spoke out, what I did was show people the solution. You know, we in America have known the problems of substance use disorder, addiction to alcohol and other drugs for centuries, but we haven't known the solution for as long because, well, up until the 1930s, people didn't recover in mass for the most
Mhm.
part. And secondly, because we tend to hide behind our recoveries for whatever the reason. And if we want to move that ball, if we want to smash that stigma and promote hope, we've got to show it and tell it with our faces and with our voices. CCAR has been doing that for a long time.
Yeah, thank you. I was Bob's first hire back in January of 1999. So
Wow.
I've been at this for 25 years, and I fully agree with the flip side to smashing or ending stigma is to promote recovery.
Yes.
And, what did Mother Teresa say? Please don't invite me to your anti-war campaign, but I'd gladly attend your pro-peace march. So, a lot of times we have like bust the stigma and people's mind go right to the stigma. But
Right?
when you say, no, we're the solution, we are in recovery, that shifts the thinking a little bit that there is a solution. Our friend Bill White, when, on top of hearing you and then shortly thereafter being introduced to Bill White, and he wrote about a vanguard of people that are willing to put their face on recovery, willing to carry the message of recovery, and immediately, like you, I think we both felt called to do that. You talk about in your books about your first speaking engagement, giving stats and numbers, and then you were savvy enough to know you were losing the audience, and you didn't
Yes.
continue. So you just
Yes.
dropped everything, and I've done the same thing. I'm shifting gears here, throwing this PowerPoint out the window or the notes. And I think when we say, my name is Phil, I'm a person in recovery, or I'm an alcoholic and addict in recovery, it changes the conversation.
It does, particularly when we follow that up by explaining how we got to that point. You know,
Hmm.
I went to treatment 4 times over 5 years between 1989 and 1994 before I sort of got it, quote unquote, and got some sustainable recovery. I think there's a lot of people, a lot of the public perception is that that treatment's got to work that first time, and that once you get into recovery, you live happily ever after. And that's why it's important that when we not only stand up and speak up and tell the rest of our stories, what we really are telling people is that this is hard work, that recovery is not a linear experience, and that while we hope to live happily ever after, the reality is that we grow older, as you and I have. We encounter chronic health conditions or acute health conditions, whether it's cancer, depression, or dementia, and that if we hadn't been given access to treatment and access to recovery assets, then our prospects of making it are not as good. I learned what I emphasize in my new book, Phil, is the importance of recovery capital. I know that CCAR has that as a cornerstone of its mission and of its efforts in communities, which is to empower people by giving them those tools, giving them what I call the assets in their individual recovery account, their IRA. And that treatment is not the end. Treatment is only the beginning of the rest of the story. And that rest of the story means, recovery capital, managing the chronic illness, and in my case, coming to terms with the recurrence of use that occurred when I had a, quote, run-in with pain medications about a decade ago.
I agree with that. People ask me, I've just recently finished up round 2 with cancer, right? In 6 chemotherapy sessions. And people say, well, how did you do it? Well, you don't, and they always talk about fighting cancer. Like he fought the good fight. I don't know how in God's name you fight a disease. I don't, my wife, Sandy, she says maybe it's because you're open to all options and you'll take options, you'll do what you need to do. But the biggest tool for me was I can do anything one day at a time.
Amen.
And that I learned early on in Alcoholics Anonymous has probably been the key slogan that's kept me in recovery for the last 36 years now. And it's one slogan. I can do anything one day at a time. I don't have to drink or drug over it. And when you go through these trials, it's also not permanent. This too shall pass.
Yeah, those phrases in 12-step recovery, they can sound trite. They can be oft abused because they're, often, regurgitated over and over again. But when it comes to applying to, here's another one, life on life's terms. When it comes to applying those slogans to the rest of our lives after we gain sustainable recovery, they really are applicable not just to our management of our recovery from substance use disorder, but also how we approach and deal with the rest of life. And the longer we're at it, like you and I, as old timers, the longer we're at it, the more the rest of life comes at us.
So talk to us a little bit about what happened with your painkillers. How did you get prescribed them? I know it was a tooth or mouth related thing. And
Yes.
I hardly have any teeth left, and they're discolored and a source of embarrassment for me. But, all of that. So we both were doing cocaine. We know that was a factor. But what happened? And just walk us through that.
Sure. In 2012, I had dental surgery, significant dental surgery, and I was prescribed opiate pain medication. Why? Because the dentist, he assumed I could handle it. And I accepted that prescription because I assumed I could handle it, and also because I didn't want to suffer. We shouldn't suffer in recovery just because we have an addictive mind.
Amen.
And we have to learn how to handle those medications. And candidly, I wasn't ignorant to the fact that addiction is cunning, baffling, and powerful and patient, but I was ignorant as to how those pain meds were going to make me feel. I had no desire, Phil, to go back to the crack house or to go to the bar and have a drink. Those were my drugs of no choice back in the 70s and 80s, crack
Yeah.
cocaine and alcohol. I love recovery. How could I not? It's better than not being in recovery. But I was prescribed the pain meds by a dentist who knew who I was, literally and figuratively. I took those pain pills at first responsibly because I was following the directions on the side of the bottle as anybody should. And then one day, about 4 or 5 days into the experience, I took my two, and then I took what I call a plus one. I just took a plus one because
Mhm.
if two made me feel good, then three would make me feel a little bit better.
Mhm.
Again, no desire to go off the deep end or throw away all those things that I had. But my brain is a little tricky. And I like the opiates. They were not like the big rush you got from cocaine or the sort of the all-encompassing effect of alcohol. The pain meds just helped me to relax a little bit more.
Mhm.
And I'd had a very tough period between the time Broken came out in 2006 and this plus one experience in 2012. I had gone through a very difficult divorce and had been left as a single dad to three very busy teenagers. I had a full-time job. I traveled, all those things about life. And when I took those pain meds,
Mhm.
oh, I liked them. I liked them. They weren't dirty. They didn't make me goofy. They were clean, I mean,
Mhm.
they were easy. And that's how it started for me, Phil. It was innocent. It was deliberate. I probably, with hindsight, should have been a little bit, not probably, I should have been a little bit more sensitive to this addict's brain. And then for 3 years on and off, I struggled to get off of those darn things.
Yeah, the plus one. My first round of cancer was in 2010, and I ended up with a feeding tube, and they gave me liquid opiate. So you had to measure
How
like
convenient.
up to the line, right? Well,
Yeah.
what happens if oops, I went over the line just a little bit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know, and I didn't luckily I had Sandy with me, and we were monitoring the amount
Yes.
of
Yes.
medication very closely. And but she left me to manage it, and I was in a lot of pain too. So there was that. But I was lucky not to develop a habit. And this time I didn't need any prescription medication. But I do know it's funny about the mind of the addict. Like,
Yeah.
because this was originated or metastasized in my intestine, I've had the fortune of having three colonoscopies this last year. But you know what?
Wonderful.
I lived for 3 seconds. That
Yeah.
when they put that IV in the top of your hand,
Yes.
and they say, and the last time I was goofing with the nurse, I was saying, "Oh, my freebie's coming." And she goes, "What do you mean freebie? You know those 3 seconds when you say start to count backwards to when you wake up? I live for those 3 seconds." And I know I'm not well because
Yeah.
I was like thoroughly, okay, Mr. Valentine, here you go. Three, two, and I just felt that and loved it. And then they
Yes.
wait, then you go, next thing you know, it's like, you're in recovery, Mr. Valentine. You're like, dang it, that's all there is. So how did this resolve for you though?
Well,
What
it
happened?
didn't resolve right away. As I said, I struggled on and off for 3 years. And by the way, hindsight being what it is, I should have empowered somebody else to manage the
Mm-hmm.
dispersing of those pills. But I was at the time largely living alone with my kids. I had not yet. Um, the woman I'm now married to, Nell Hurley, who I think you know,
Oh yeah.
she wasn't living with me yet, and so she was sort of out of the loop. Uh, so I didn't have any governor, if you will, on the dispensing of those meds. And and it was a struggle, not all the time, but on and off. And I could never turn off that craving brain like I did when I would go to a meeting for my crack addiction, or like I did when I would go to a meeting for my alcohol addiction. I learned, Phil, along the way that a drug is not a drug, is not a drug, that opiates are a different beast. I call them the Trojan horse of addiction.
Mm-hmm.
They are so subtle and all encompassing when it comes to taking over my brain. Uh, to the point that I couldn't get off of them. I couldn't get off of them by going to meetings or doing my meditations or getting on my knees or any of that stuff. I could not. And I tried and I tried and I was nervous, or I was ashamed to ask for help. Who am I? I'm Mr. Recovery. I work for Hazel and Betty Ford. I'm the guy who's supposed to know all this stuff. And I couldn't get off of them of my own free will. And I couldn't get off of them with any of the tools that I had been given and I had used successfully for decades as it related to my other addictions. Finally, my internist, a doctor in St. Paul, where I live and where I'm coming to you today, he also was in recovery, long-term recovery. He'd been my internist for a long time. And he said, William, there's nothing more I can do for you in my office. You're going to need some power greater than me, your internist, and power greater than the 12 steps and so on. So he sent me to an addiction doc in Minneapolis who prescribed medication for me, an anti-craving medication called Suboxone, which is an FDA-approved anti-craving med for opiate use disorder. There's a lot of stigma and around the use of opiate, or around the use of medications in the treatment of any addiction, but particularly in opioid use disorder. So I was a little wary, honestly, even though Hazel and Betty Ford had been using Suboxone in our program, in our treatment program for our opiate dependent patients. I was still wary of it, but I took it. I was prescribed it by the doc in January of 2016, and it was a miracle drug. I put a little film under my tongue, case closed. I was done. I had no interest in pain pills. I had every interest in getting back on track. It worked. It worked. So that's how I finally turned that corner. Now, having said that, Phil, I'm also very fortunate that, as I alluded to earlier, I had a lot of recovery capital. Over the decades, I had been investing a lot in my individual recovery account. I think we all have them. And we never invest in those. It's like retirement accounts. You and I were talking about retirement before we got on here. We don't save for retirement under the assumption we're never going to use it. We save for retirement, whether it's Social Security, a pension, a 401k, whatever. We save under the assumption that one day we're going to tap into it and draw down. And the same is true for me in my recovery. I put a lot in my individual recovery account, assuming that one day I would need it, never assuming it would be as a result of this run-in with pain meds. And I drew down on it. So I was lucky that I was able to carry on long enough to get to the point where I was prescribed the Suboxone. But I was able to carry on in part because, one, I loved recovery. Two, I understood what the stakes were. And three, I had a lot of recovery capital. I had a lot invested that I could draw down on and help keep me sort of upright, if you will. And then when I did take the meds, the Suboxone, it just right-sided me again. I got, I was able to get back onto the track of recovery that had been so important to me for decades.
So you talk about recovery capital and drawing from that account. Give me, if you can, an example.
Sure. And there's a lot of them. So one of the fundamental ones for an advocate like me is when I help somebody else, I'm helped. I mean, that's sort of a principle of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? We give away what we have because we get it back, whether it's somebody asking me to access treatment, whether it's somebody wanting to be a temporary sponsor, whatever it is. When I help another alcoholic or an addict or their family, I help myself. So that's one. Two, just all the recovery meetings I went to over the decades. When I go to those meetings, I always come out of them feeling better. So a little bit of that feeling better goes into the bank, if you will. Another one would be the morning meditations that I do. Another one would be my spiritual condition. And for me, that includes church. I like to go to church on Sundays. I like to walk to church, even in the dead of winter in Minnesota. It's just something calming and affirming about that. So my spiritual condition, all those things, Phil, that I assumed would protect me from a recurrence of use did not protect me from a recurrence of use. But what they did was give me those assets, which allowed me ultimately to get back on track.
So those are, and I'm going to put you a little bit here. So those are like deposits into the account.
Yes.
What does the withdrawal look like? Withdrawal from the individual recovery account.
Yes, yeah, and no one's ever asked me that. Even though I've done a lot of interviews as it relates to my book coming out in September. So thank you for asking that. So a withdrawal would be when I felt like giving up. When I would be like, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep fighting these pain pills. I would go and draw down on my assets, and it would remind me, no, William, you're worth it. There is hope. You can make it. Another withdrawal would be when I just wanted to go bury my head in the sand, so to speak, and yet I would answer the phone or answer an email from somebody who needed help. I get a lot of requests for help because, like you, I'm very public about my story. I happen to work for an organization that's quite public too, the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation. So I get on average 3 to 5 requests for help a day, 360 days of the year-ish. So I'm always getting requests for help. If I turn my back on those people, then I'm turning my own back on my own recovery. So I just hung in there and answered every one of those calls. I continued to meet my obligations as a father. And the only way I was able to do that was to draw down on some of the recovery capital that I had by reminding myself that I brought these 3 beautiful children into the world and I needed to be their father, darn it. So those are the kinds of things. And also, frankly, as it relates to my connection to a higher power that I call God, I would draw down by pausing, whether I was on an airplane or out for a walk or at my desk. I would pause and I would connect and I would say, higher power, God, help me, help me. And just that act of pausing and asking for help was enough ultimately that got me, to the point where I could get the medication that I needed to get back on track.
Yeah, that's a great story about using that medication and Suboxone. When I think about drawing down from the account, the note I just jotted to myself, because I ask these questions when I'm doing a lot of my coaching.
Yeah.
And I'm just more curious and fascinating because I hadn't really thought about, but even when I'm in the throes of in the hospital, hooked up to tubes and all of this, I think when I know I'm going to be okay. And I think you don't always know that. So you're drawing that down from saying, from your experience, from what you put in the bank, that I'm going to be okay. This will pass. And I know that because I've been through so much of life. I've also come to a point in my recovery, maybe evolved to it, that I look for awe, AWE, and wonder in every day. And I look at the adventure of life. And I say, when I say, I need some energy, I got to draw down from this bank because I need some energy right now to figure out how I'm going to enjoy this day, because right now I feel like shit and I don't want to enjoy this day at all. And I think all that recovery capital helps you do that.
Well, because life is hard. Life is hard. Hey, listen, there's only one thing.
Wait. This is the thing. What does hard mean to you? What does it mean to you? Because everybody says that. What life is hard. What does hard mean to you?
It means accepting the reality that it isn't always going to be good, and a recurrence of use is going to happen, and a divorce is going to happen. I've always believed through the experiences of the last decade that the only thing more difficult than living life sober is living life drunk. So if you take away the drunk part, then what does that mean? Life is hard. Is it worth it? Absolutely. But it's hard. And for decades after I came out of the crack house in Atlanta in 1994, I was pretty much, as I wrote in the new book, my life looked like the upward chart of a bull market. Up it went, wow. I mean, there were some moments in there, but I had a pretty good run, man, for 20 years. And then all of a sudden, in 2006, as my first book, Broken, is coming out and becoming a New York Times bestseller, and I'm getting lots of adulation, lots of attention, and helping a lot of people, the bottom fell out of my life, stone cold sober. I strayed my moral bounds in my marriage. Huh?
Yeah.
Wait a minute, that's not what sober people do. My wife became seriously ill with mental health issues that required treatment for months in other states far from Minnesota, and I was left home alone with these kids. I got a new boss at Hazelden in 2008, 2009. I mean, not that that's a big deal, but it was there's challenges to life.
Sure.
And then, Bill, in 2008, I hit bottom, stone cold sober. Long before my pain pill issue in 2008, my wife at the time, we've been together for 20 years. She's a mother of the three children. She decided she just couldn't go on anymore. And I hit bottom sober. And what I realized in 2008 was that letting go of other substances was a hell of a lot easier than letting go of other people, particularly people that I loved, or people that if they would just do what I told them to do, they would get it. I had a broken heart in 2008. Yeah. That was when I became a double winner. I'd been a 12-step AA guy for a long time, and in 2008, I became a new member of Al-Anon, where I learned what it's like to let go of other people, particularly those that I care for or love. And I had to go through that experience of a broken heart, stone cold sober. That's hard. That's hard for me. So that's what I talked about when I said that life is hard, and yet I was sober during that time, which I'm glad for it. Then when I had my run-in with the pain meds, not only was that a hard couple of years, but I also began to question, Phil, I also began to question, what does it really mean? What does my sobriety really mean to me? And that's when I ultimately was to discover that there's more to recovery than sobriety. Now, sobriety is a fundamental important condition for people like us who can't just say no. But I had a couple of years of struggling with these pain meds, and there's no doubt I was not sober the way that I had always defined sobriety. And yet I still was recovering. I still liked trying to be a better man, trying to be a decent human being, trying to help others, continuing to be a public advocate. I began to realize that God box I have, which is filled, in fact, I have it right here. I'm going to use it in my upcoming speeches. I have a God box here that a psych nurse gave me. And in it are all my medallions, right? For all the decades, white chips, 1 year, 2 years, 15 years, whatever. I got my God box. And I realized that, those medallions, they still counted for something. My consecutive streak of sobriety, of not using, had been interrupted. But you know what? In the same way that we count and we're grateful for remission from cancer, when the cancer comes back, we don't say, oh, well, that was a waste of time, or, oh, those 5 years don't count. As you intimately know, those years are gifts, even when your cancer comes back. So my point being that I discovered that I could still consider myself to be a man in long-term recovery, even though my sobriety had been interrupted. And I think that's a really important message of this book.
Are you ready to make a difference in the lives of others? If so, then you should consider becoming a recovery coach. Recovery coaches are trained to help people in recovery, seeking recovery, or struggling with addiction. They provide support, guidance, and resources to help people on their recovery journey. CCAR Training is the leading provider of recovery coach training programs. Our programs are designed to teach you the skills and knowledge, what we call the science, while giving you an understanding of your own art needed to be a successful recovery coach. We offer a variety of training options, most offered online. If you're interested in becoming a recovery coach or just learning more, I encourage you to visit our website or contact us today. We would be happy to answer any questions you have and help you get started on your journey to becoming a recovery coach. We hope you'll visit us at www.addictionrecoverytraining.org to learn more.
I love that message. And for years, I've been asking the question when I speak, do you consider sobriety / recovery in terms of consecutive time or cumulative time? So there was a guy early on in my recovery. He would introduce himself. He said, "Yeah, I've been in recovery for 10 years, except for 3 days."
Yeah.
And I was like, and people would like get all indignant and wince about all that. And I thought it was brilliant in some ways because he had drank on 3 separate, three separate New Year's Eves. And,
There you go.
I was like,
There you go.
I've been in 10 years except for 3 days.
And why not? Bill, and why not? I mean, we know that the ultimate goal for us, the best formula for us is 1 + 1 + 1 adds up to a stretch of abstinence or sobriety. But sobriety is not a natural human condition. If it was, more people would be sober. But people have a beer at the football game. They have a drink at a wedding. They have a drink at a funeral. I mean, people are always trying to, change the way they feel or interact with the world. It's just that some of us have these brains that are vulnerable. We can't turn it off. But the point is that recovery, for me, and again, I think recovery is a highly personalized individual experience, that there is no one size shoe fits all, because it just can't be that way. But that recovery for me is about striving to be a better man, striving to use the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous to deal with my defects of character, trying to help other people along my way. If I have a recurrence of use, that doesn't wipe that out or take away all that time any more than it does with the recurrence of cancer with cancer patients.
When I told that story at somewhere I spoke, this woman came up to me afterwards, and it goes into this. It's this policy we have in the field that people need a certain time of abstinence or recovery in order to work in the field, which I think is absolute horseshit, because there's nothing magical about the 366th day or whatever. But this woman came up to me, and I had said that. And she said, "I'm so glad you said that, because I had 20 years in recovery. My husband died. I went out for like 20 days or something. And now I've been clean for another 18 months. But in order to be in my role, you need to have 2 years of recovery." And she'd been in the role for 5 or 6 years. She's told no one at work, because she's afraid they'd fire her because she no longer meets the criteria of having two years of recovery to work in the field.
So on that note, after I disclosed on the stage at the Betty Ford Center in February of 2016, a month after I had started to take the Suboxone, I was able to sort of present the entire picture of those last 3 years of my beyond broken experience. And that caused quite a stir, and I didn't do it the right way. I hadn't forewarned anybody, my own boss, the CEO, Mark Mishik, or the board, or anybody like that. I hadn't really informed them on what had happened to me. And all of a sudden, there I am disclosing the miracle drug Suboxone. There was quite a bit of shock, surprise, and there was some pushback, including from a colleague of mine who was in a position of real authority in the organization who said to me, you should not be speaking on behalf of the organization until you have a year again. And I said, a year of what? I said, I've been a spokesman, an advocate for this organization since 1996. And you're now telling me that because I had this experience with pain meds, that was not a good experience, that all those decades of practical, personal, and professional testimony or effort on behalf of this field doesn't count anymore. I have to have a year. A year of what? The other thing I also discovered in the rooms of recovery, and I'm not being critical here at all, I'm just speaking to my truth in this context, which was when I disclosed that I had this run-in with pain pills and that I had used Suboxone to get me back in the middle of the bed, so to speak, people said that I wasn't sober. And these were some of these people who were telling me I wasn't sober were people who were smoking cigarettes. And I remember a great wise man in the recovery community in the Twin Cities telling me that if you're using Suboxone, you're not sober. And when we got done talking that through at a coffee shop, we went outside and he reached into his pocket and he lit up a cigarette. And he took a drag off that cigarette. And I said, you're not sober. And he said, what do you mean I'm not sober? I said, you're using nicotine to maintain your 55 years of continuous sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. And what's the difference? When I told that story to Bill White, by the way, I was down in Florida last week to meet with Bill because I'm getting ready for a book tour and I needed to process some things with him. And he and I had lunch last week down in his hometown, or where he lives now. I said, Bill, what's the difference between buprenorphine, which is the anti-craving medication, and tobacco, as it relates to recovery? And he said, well, he said, they're not the same. He said, buprenorphine won't kill you, but tobacco will.
Oh, wow.
I thought it was a really interesting insight there. So there's a lot of stigma around the use of anti-craving medications in the recovery community,
There
which we need
certainly
to
is.
address.
We addressed that early, and I think it's one of the reasons we've been around for the
Yes.
25 years is you're in recovery if you say you are.
Yes.
Who the hell am I to say if somebody else is in recovery or not?
Yes. I know.
And what a profound, those were in the formative years of CCAR where we were trying to define recovery. And we were having discussions about abstinence, about the use of medication, all of that stuff. Methadone came up. And somebody said it's a lot like Alcoholics Anonymous. The only requirement for membership is what? A desire. Who says if you have the desire or not? So we said, you're in recovery when you say you are. And it's worked wonders for us. People bristle at that a definition because it's more of a philosophy than a definition, but it's worked wonders for us because that empowers our two most powerful questions. How can I help you with your recovery today? Yes. Your recovery, and what does recovery look like for you?
I think that is such an important message that I like to think that my own experience, as I've related in my new book, Broken Open, sort of conveys, which is that there are many pathways to recovery. And even within those pathways, there are pathways. And we, as a field, have got, and I use that broadest strokes to describe the field because there's so many aspects of the field, whether it's prevention on the front end, treatment like at Hazel and Betty Ford, CCAR on the sort of backside of the equation in terms of helping people. I think we have got to somehow come to a consensus about the fact that we do have these differences of opinion, that we're going to have divergent definitions of recovery, but that if we really want to advance this field and help more people, we have to be as broad stroked and as all encompassing as we can be to help people.
The multiple pathways piece for me was, I was very much the first 10 years of my recovery, staunch AA.
Yes.
big book thumper that,
Yes.
and I
Yes.
realized as I trained many, many coaches over many years, is that I was afraid. I was very defensive of my program of recovery because if somebody recovered differently than I was, I saw it as a threat.
Yeah, interesting.
If someone recovers differently than me, that's no longer a threat. As a matter of fact, I'm super curious to see if the way you're doing it could work for somebody I might help. Like my
Yes.
son Matthew is in his he's 22. He's found recovery. It is abstinence because that's what he chose, but it's not 12-step based. It's fitness based and it's faith based, you know?
So thank you for disclosing that. So in my book, although I'm not as specific about it, because I need to respect my own children's pathways, you know that all three of my children have come to me and asked for help from substances.
Yeah.
One of them, 10 years later, continues to drink, but drinks differently. There's no doubt that child is in recovery. A very successful person, manages it, but continues to have one or two now and then. I have another child who came to me 5 years ago and asked for help. And and in January of a year ago, that person found dry January and has been in recovery from that desperate condition. And then I have another child who came and asked for help, went to treatment at Hazelden twice, which is an abstinence-based program, as you know, where we hang the 12 steps on the wall. And that child there's no doubt, for 5 years now, that child of mine is in recovery, but does not attend 12-step meetings. So they're all recovering differently than their dear old dad, but they're recovering from the desperate condition of too much drinking and drugging. Bingo. Right.
And when we talk about pathways, I've also often wondered about, is that the best choice, right, of word?
Yeah, what should it be, Phil?
Well, I'm thinking more that we weave a tapestry of recovery.
Yes.
And so and it's like a tapestry of life in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And so, I've said like my AA background, 10, 15 years, I'm looking in retirement to going back to meetings because I just breathe and it's just the energy. I love it. And I love the way people are open and honest. Is that maybe that's royal blue, and then you get outside and do major walks and it's green, or being on the water is whatever, but you got tinsel of spirituality and gold and silver. But you create your own tapestry and patterns. That's everyone's life. So how you're beginning to weave your own tapestry of recovery is fascinating to me. And if you were to do that, what would the colors be and what would they represent?
I remember one of the first times I began to contemplate that. It was before I had ever had my run-in with pain meds. I remember hearing that Alcoholics Anonymous, the main headquarters in New York, talked about the fact that they had 2 to 3 million active members at any given time. And this was back in the 2000s sometimes. So they had 2 to 3 million people who considered themselves to be actively engaged in 12-step recovery. They were members of Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Al-Anon. And yet, we've seen these studies which say that 25 to 30 million people consider themselves to be, quote, in recovery. Well, then where are they? If they're not in the membership roles, so to speak, of 12-step recovery, where are they? Well, they're doing yoga. They're going to church. They're doing alternate pathways or spinning their own fabrics of recovery in a way that works for them. And as Bill White reminded me when we talked recently, a lot of people, they have a problem with substances and they alter their use or they stop using and they just get on with their lives. They don't necessarily even count themselves being recovered. They just have put that behind them. And I think we've got to remember there's a big group of them too.
Yeah. I think too about when I hiked the trail in 2015, there was a guy whose trail name was Detox because he started the trail. He had come off a long bender. He detoxed the first 5-7 days on the trail. And then, as far as I know, he's living in the Philippines, happily married with a family, and has never returned to use. and never returned to, like, I don't think 12 steps at all. He never went. He
Well,
just did it himself.
and I feel fortunate that I was introduced to the 12 steps through my treatment experiences, plural, because the irony of it is I went to treatment 4 times, as I said, over 5 years in the late 80s, early 90s, and I got the same approach every time. There was no difference in it, you know. But ultimately I embraced it, and the 12 steps, they are well written for people like me.
Me too.
You know, and I do understand that for me, my drinking is but a symptom, that there's way more to my addiction and way more to my recovery than just the substance or just not using the substance. So I'm grateful to have those tools. But I've realized along my journey that it's not just, like I said, that V-shaped where I went down, hit my bottom, and then went up. I went down, hit my bottom, started to come up, and then I've been on a roller coaster ever since. And I think it's real important, especially us old timers who've been doing this for a long time, that we talk about that, because, you know, what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. Well, the older you get, the longer that timeline is.
For
a lot of
sure.
stuff happens.
Well, and I also want to be clear too, there seems to be a dichotomy that you can't be both 12-step oriented and multiple pathways oriented. It seems like if you're multiple pathways, a lot of people are anti-12-step.
Right.
And if you're in 12 steps, all that other stuff is a bunch of crap, and they're all gonna go back and use and die. But I think it's a both and. It's not either or. I have a big question for you.
Please.
So, and I've been contemplating this. So this is more of a personal. I'm very curious about what conclusions you've come to. A couple of years ago, my parents, who had been divorced 40 years, died within 48 hours of each other. And because of recovery, I was able to be at both their bedsides. I delivered eulogies at both their services, 2 days apart. Very grateful for all that. But it definitely rocked you. And you ask a question about, what do I want to do with the time I have left? How well have I lived? How well have I loved? Those are all big questions. But for you, William, what is the meaning of life, which is different than the purpose of life for me? But I would love to hear where you are today with those, like, big questions.
Well, that's a good one, Phil, and I have to think about that. But in response for now and your audience, I live my life with a sense of wonderment. I mean, I'm 65 years old and I still act like a kid at times. I'm almost giddy around the fact that this has happened to me, and this being the life that I've had since August the 5th, 1989, 35 years ago today. What? Who, me? How? From adversity comes opportunity. I was a chronic alcoholic and an addict at the age of 30 years old in 1989. And that's not very fun. And the prospects of having a good life are not very good. And all of a sudden, it's 35 years later, and I feel worthy. I feel worthy of the gifts that have come my way, to the extent that I feel my worthiness needs to be passed on or given back. Life is so darn short. Even if you live to be 100, that's a blink of an eye in the history of civilization, much less the history of the world. But so what do I do in the time that I have, not knowing how much that's going to be, but knowing it's a finite number? What do I do? And for me, the meaning of life is about doing my best to make life better, not just for me, but for those around me, however I want to define around me. So the meaning of life is short. The meaning of life is a gift. In the end, when I die, whether it's later this afternoon or 20, 30 years from now, I feel confident that I will be content that from the adversity of my addiction came the opportunity to recover. And during that period of my recovery over these decades, I have striven to be a decent human being who helps other people to find their own decency.
Wow. You didn't know I was going to ask that question, but I've come to something similar. I think God, for me, the way I interpret God, the meaning of life is He wants us to enjoy it, which is me looking for awe and wonder. I mean, just this weekend, I'm out on my kayak. There's a thunderstorm off in the distance to just look at clouds and then see, there's this magnificent thunderstorm going on here. And then I'm conscious of the boat rocking on the water. And then I'm also watching the osprey looking for dinner. I mean, just what joy that brings me. And then I think I align fully with you. We have an obligation to make life enjoyable for others. So, and that could be helping them find recovery. It could be giving someone $1 on this. I don't know what it is, but how we do that. And then finally, I've landed on this, what bizarre for me, because I never thought I'd land here, is that we're on this spaceship going through, and we got to take care of our spaceship. We can't be like polluting it and covering it in plastic and doing all that stuff. So what's my little part just to take care of our spaceship so my kids and future generations can enjoy this ride for as long as it goes on?
Yes, I'm still running after all these decades, and I ran yesterday morning, and I ran the morning before, and a couple days a week. And I've gotten into this thing lately where when I'm running, I pick up empty cans or plastic bottles that people sort of toss out of their cars along the road, and I can get a pretty good handful of those, and then I put them in a recycling bin. Now, it's just a small number in the scheme of all the discarded trash out there, but it's my contribution. And so it's my small contribution.
Yeah.
Phil, there was once a time in my life, because I come from parents who were incredibly successful, the journalists Judith and Bill Moyers, and who are still living. My dad's 90, my mother's 89, but they're struggling now with end of life issues. There was a time I was so ambitious. I wanted to not only be like them, but I wanted to save the world. Well, how silly is that? And I learned through my recovery journey that I can't save the world, but what I can do is help a few people to be saved. And if I can help a few people, those who struggle with our illness and those who deserve what we have, which is recovery, if I can help a few people, then I've lived a good life.
When two more thoughts. I got two more questions. You keep bringing them up. But you talk a lot about, this. And in your first book, it's a smash book, right? The first one. And then the second one. Do you have any regrets writing it?
Great question. I'm getting that question. It's a little scary to stick yourself out there, And one of my defects of character is my perfectionism. And it's hard to be perfect when you're in the body of a human being. And it's hard to feign perfection when you're writing about your imperfections. So, I'm a little apprehensive about what people are going to read and how they're going to construe it or interpret it. But, I learned a long time ago as an advocate in this field that if I want to help people, I've got to put myself out there. Now, that doesn't mean I get into all the nitty gritty, and I think I've handled some of my imperfections in this new book. I think I've handled them appropriately. I didn't get into the sordid details of the stuff that are all about life, but I'm a little apprehensive about it because I'm afraid that people will misinterpret it or find, especially in this wicked world that we live in, where there are no prisoners. There are just winners and losers. It seems. I'm a little apprehensive about it, but I'm okay in my own skin about it. And at the end, that's how I define my own life, is my ability to live in my own skin despite me sometimes.
Well, what I've read, and I've taken a stab at writing about putting a lot of my life's journey when I hiked the Appalachian Trail, not nearly the level as you are, but I have a little bit of an understanding of what it's like to put yourself out there.
Yeah.
But I just admire and appreciate the honesty, and you're telling your truth. Doesn't even seem like blame or judgment. This is just me. This is my story. This is my truth. And a lot like I tell a story about fishing, sometimes, you tell people the truth, but what they do with it is up to them.
Right,
You
right.
know, and I don't think we can ever be faulted for. We can only know our intention, right?
Yes.
And our intention, why I wrote the book is, well, hey, I just wanted my kids to really hear the story
Yeah,
too,
yeah.
to know me. That was first and foremost, write it for my people closest to me. And if somebody gets something out of it, wonderful. But it wasn't
Yes.
like I wasn't doing it to get rich or to be
Right.
famous or to do any of that stuff. I can only be sure of my intention.
That's exactly right. And I like to think that in my humanness, people can find their own permission to be human as well. And to be human is to be imperfect, but to be human is to be real. And particularly when we're talking about addiction, treatment, and recovery issues, we have to be real.
Mm-hmm. Like Art Woodard always said, intimacy is into me, you see. And
Yeah.
so you've allowed us to see into your life for the last several decades. And you've paid some price for that. You've paid a little bit of price for that.
Yes,
But
sir.
I do appreciate you being such a profound spokesperson and and a gifted speaker and communicator, and it shows in this book as well. So,
Thank you, Phil. I count my greatest success by the people that I have crossed in my paths. And you early on were one of those. I don't want this to go to your head, but you were a titan. You were a titan of the kind of advocacy that was not just about being at a podium or on a pedestal, but an advocate who took your own experience and took it down into the community and pushed it out, in a way that touched people who really needed to be touched through what you've done at CCAR. I mean, extraordinary work.
Thank you. And it's our foundational principle. It's
Right.
recovery first. That's
Yes.
one of our principles, that everything we do is about recovery. The agency is a distant second, and the individual is even a more distant third. But it's how we carry the message of recovery. That was from Bill, right? You carrying the message of recovery. Bill Wilson said about his journey of recovery that it was a journey towards humility. And as we become more and more humble as we get older and older, and I think as the end of life approaches, you can't help but become more humble.
Yes.
And I see that in you. And you wear it really well.
Thank you, my friend.
You can have some time if you'd like to just give an overview of the book, and where people can find it,
Sure,
and all that kind of
sure.
stuff.
So the book is called Broken Open. I have a copy of it here. Broken Open: What Painkillers Taught Me About Life and Recovery. Hey, you've got one too. It's a follow-up to my first book, Broken, which is still in print 19 years later, but lots happened in that 19 years. So that's what this book is about. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it through Simon & Schuster. It'll be out on September the 3rd. I'm quietly confident, Phil, that it's pretty good. And by pretty good, I mean, I think people will find that it resonates with them as they continue along their own journeys. One of the key messages is that hope is a strategy. And for people who are watching this podcast and maybe without hope today, hang on. There is help available, whether it's through CCAR or Hazel and Betty Ford or the Salvation Army. There are pathways into this miraculous experience called recovery that you and I have talked about today. I'm proud of the book. I think it's going to do pretty well. If it touches the lives of 10 people, I'll be content.
Exactly. I've read about the first 100 pages. It's extremely well written and just inspiring. I mean, it's, don't let this get to your head, but it's got a little Ernest Hemingway in it, that that it's written so simply and beautifully that it flows. It really does. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to carry the message to your constituents at CCAR and beyond. I think what you as a man, you as a fellow traveler, and what your organization has done is a gift to all of us, and it inspires me all these decades later. So thank you, Phil.
Yeah, thank you. I hope when retirement calls that I'll still be available for consulting, and I'll definitely be in touch because I want to work with other RCOs around the country and globe to share what we've learned in my 25 years here.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Phil.
Take care.
All right, man.
Bye.